The Stamp Act and the birth of colonial resistance. The Stamp Act and the birth of colonial resistance. The pages of history are often marked by pivotal moments that shape the course of nations and societies. Among these moments, the Stamp Act of 1765 stands as a defining event in the annals of American colonial history. This legislation, imposed by the British Parliament on its North American colonies, ignited a spark of resistance that ultimately fueled the flames of revolution. The Stamp Act was not merely a tax on paper products, it was a catalyst that revealed the growing discontent and the birth of colonial resistance against British rule. Origins and intent of the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act emerged in the aftermath of the French and Indian War, a conflict that had left Britain with a staggering debt. Seeking to alleviate this financial burden, the British Parliament turned to its American colonies as a source of revenue. The Act itself mandated that a variety of printed materials, including newspapers, legal documents, licenses, and even playing cards, bear a revenue stamp. These stamps were to be purchased from British officials and affixed to the documents, indicating that the required tax had been paid. The measure appeared reasonable from a British perspective. After all, the colonists benefited from the protection of the British military and the stability of the empire. However, it was the colonial response that would change the course of history. Colonial outrage and unity. The Stamp Act struck a chord of resentment among the American colonists. To them, the imposition of taxes without their consent was an affront to their rights as British subjects. This concept, rooted in the principle of no taxation without representation, emphasized that taxation should only be enacted with the agreement of elected representatives from the taxed population. The colonial response was swift and united. Protests erupted across the colonies, uniting diverse groups of people in a common cause. Merchants, artisans, lawyers, and ordinary citizens came together in opposition to the Stamp Act. The Sons of Liberty, a secret organization formed to resist British policies, played a significant role in orchestrating protests and boycotting British goods. Their efforts created a groundswell of resistance that transcended social and economic divisions. The road to resistance. The colonial response to the Stamp Act manifested in a variety of ways. The most visible form of resistance was the boycott of British goods. Colonists refused to purchase items subject to the tax and instead sought alternatives produced within their communities. This economic pressure sent a powerful message to British merchants and policymakers. The effectiveness of the boycotts was evident as British trade suffered a significant blow due to reduced demand from the colonies. Yet, it was not just economic pressure that defined the resistance. Intellectuals and writers also contributed to the movement. Prominent figures such as Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, and John Dickinson penned influential essays and speeches denouncing the Stamp Act as a violation of colonial rights. Their writings resonated with the general public, spreading ideas of liberty and self-determination. The Stamp Act Congress. As the colonies grappled with their response, a pivotal event occurred in the form of the Stamp Act Congress. Delegates from 9 colonies convened in New York City in October 1765 to address the crisis. This gathering marked a significant step toward colonial unity, as it was the first time representatives from various colonies came together to formulate a collective response to British policy. The Stamp Act Congress drafted a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, which asserted that the colonies possessed the same rights as British citizens and could not be taxed without their consent. While this document fell short of advocating outright independence, it laid the foundation for future assertions of colonial rights and autonomy. Repeal of the Stamp Act. The colonial resistance and the economic impact of the boycotts reverberated across the Atlantic, prompting a shift in British policy. The Stamp Act's impact on trade and the growing unrest in the colonies compelled the British Parliament to reconsider its stance. In 1766, the Stamp Act was repealed, marking a significant victory for colonial resistance. However, this success was tempered by the passage of the Declaratory Act, which asserted the British Parliament's authority to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Legacy and lessons. The Stamp Act crisis and the subsequent resistance laid the groundwork for the American Revolution. The spirit of unity and defiance exhibited by the colonists during this period would serve as a template for future revolutionary actions. The boycotts, protests, and intellectual debates showcase the power of collective action in shaping political outcomes. Moreover, the Stamp Act crisis highlighted the evolving identity of the American colonists. While they still identified as British subjects, they were increasingly defining themselves as a distinct community with shared values and interests. The resistance against the Stamp Act demonstrated the colonists' willingness to stand up for their rights and demand fair treatment from the British government. Conclusion. The Stamp Act of 1765 was a watershed moment that marked the birth of colonial resistance against British rule. The imposition of this tax ignited a firestorm of protest, uniting colonists from diverse backgrounds in opposition to perceived injustices. This chapter in history reminds us of the power of collective action in the face of oppression and the importance of defending fundamental rights. The enduring relevance of the Stamp Act crisis. The lessons drawn from the Stamp Act crisis continue to resonate in modern times. The struggle for representation, the rejection of unjust taxation, and the demand for individual rights remain integral to the democratic values upheld by nations around the world. The concepts of self-governance and the responsibility of a government to its citizens were profoundly shaped by the events that unfolded during this period. The idea of no taxation without representation has transcended its historical context to become a universal principle of democracy. This principle underscores the importance of a government's accountability to its citizens and their consent in matters of taxation.